Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Daniëlla from FaceUp, and we work with compliance, legal, and HR teams to help organizations manage employee reporting and investigations. One challenge that comes up often in our conversations with compliance and HR teams is when businesses start scaling faster than their compliance programs and the issues that arise from this. As companies enter new markets, raise funding, or prepare for increased regulatory scrutiny, compliance becomes a strategic business conversation rather than just a legal requirement. This today is the first of a two-part conversation. Today, we are going to focus on making the business case for compliance. And in our next session, we will look at how to actually build and prioritize a compliance program that can scale alongside your business. To help us navigate this conversation today, I am joined by Elizabeth Barbosa. Liz, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, Daniela. It's so nice to see you again. Yes, I'm a compliance executive with 20 plus years building governance programs in financial services, gaming, and technology industries. I've twice built compliance programs from a blank page, first at JPMorgan, then at FanDuel. As the first risk hire, scaling their governance framework, GRC, platforms, policy and procedures, training programs, all to meet regulatory and audit and board scrutiny. Um, I like to say I'm known for embedding compliance into the company culture by really being able to translate it into the language that the employees understand and talk their speed essentially, and doing that by really partnering with the business on the commercial side, whether it be financial services, the bankers, or the engineers in a tech company, just to understand what the current controls are and to build them and help translate so they can understand the complex regulatory environments that they're under so they can comply. Yeah, that's a little bit about myself and what I've done professionally.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. And I think you mentioned 2 points already that I think will become a recurrent theme during our conversation. One is to partner with the business, and the other part is to translate into their language the compliance needs and why that is important. My first question to you to get us started is you say that every fast growing company hits attention, you say is the rocket ship problem. Can you share a little bit with us what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean, it's also often referred to as, building the plane as you're flying it. But that's when the company is really growing and building. And there's this tension where hypergrowth companies, you know, could use compliance as a brake, and then that really stops the business and the commercial growth. Or say, hey, let's just build it and figure it out later, what the regulations are and what we need to do, which exposes the company to a lot of risk. And we've all read articles or seen, blasts about companies that get in trouble. They just have built it without checking what the regulations are and have to be shut down or stops the business. So that's kind of, what I mean by that tension for the hypergrowth company when, do you put the brakes on or do you just let it go, and finding the middle to make sure it can continue to grow and not stop the business.
hmm And I think that is very important between not slowing the business down, but also making sure that the business is covered in terms of risks. And I've heard you say this also in our prep conversation that it is very important that before you touch any control, you understand the business itself, that you understand the business model, the regulations, the risk. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is probably the most important thing when you start building any compliance program or in your role as you're, figuring out the landscape. You have to understand the company, the drivers for the business, what the priorities are for the company and the business and the executives. So then you can translate it and talk it into their language. So, what does that look like? So, you need to understand and use the product or the service or whatever the company is, building, to understand like who the regulators are, what regulations are applicable, so you can speak their language to the business, so they and that's the way they can start trusting you too. If you understand what the business is and what their priorities are, and that also can help you focus on what you need to start working on first. You know, this is a demonstration to leadership that you understand their priorities, and that your priorities need to be aligned with the companies and their business and that growth. Remember, if you just like pull something that's generic, like the generic compliance playbook, that doesn't match what the priorities are, you're going to fail, and so you have to understand what are the revenue drivers, where's the money coming from, who are the customers, and also like who are the regulators, and have a relationship with them and understand what's driving them, and kind of it's almost like putting a puzzle together and getting the pieces, but really understanding the language of the company and what their priorities are to build trust with senior leadership.
Hmm. And I think that once you build this trust with senior leadership, that they see you as part of their team. It's not one against the other. So it becomes helpful. However, there might be situations, Liz, and I'm sure you know examples of this, where leadership simply isn't prioritizing compliance internally or as a category. You've already touched on this, but can we go a little bit deeper? How do you get heard in these situations when leadership really hasn't put it in the priority list?
Right. I mean, and it depends on the company and the industry that you're working on in terms of how you take the message and how you craft that message. But again, going back to understanding what drives the company and then understanding what the risks are, understanding how the executives see the risk. So for them, like having a policy and procedure may not mean anything to them. Like no one's going to read it. Who cares? You have to kind of make the link to them. Like, no, it's not just a piece of paper. We have to tell the employees that they cannot do X, Y, or Z, or that'll be the violation of a regulation. Or we have to have this legend on every, uh, email related to the product because XYZ regulation requires it. And once we have like the standard and show examples of lessons learned of other companies who have misstepped to in the similar industry, so they can understand what the risk is and what the fine might be.
Hmm.
We were, in the previous company I worked at, we were really able to leverage a lot that had happened in Europe in that industry in terms of fines and prohibitions. And because it was such an early industry here in the US, we could point to what had happened in Europe and say, we don't want that to happen here. So, and really the executives understood that risk and how that had crippled the business in Europe. So just translating to how it could happen here and examples of things that had happened here. So I think the lessons learned, and all of us who work in compliance know how important training on lessons learned, or maybe it's not a whole training module because people get tired of training, but it's an email blast, a summary on what happened and who had to pay how much money to regulators is really helpful.
Hmm. Um, and I think this part reminds me a bit of our conversation yesterday when we were prepping. At a certain point, you said that it's important to not do compliance from the ivory tower. I did mention that I was going to bring it up today. Um, and it reminds me what you're saying now a little bit of that you need to come to be at the level of the people that you're speaking with so that they understand it and not just do it from a place up above that seems unreachable.
Correct. And part of that is like, again, understanding the business and the regulations, speaking their language, using examples of things that they're already doing that are controls. Like that's an important part of it too, is leveraging off of what is already being done at the company. And that's like really getting to know the business and understanding what they do. Oh, you already have this process in place where it's, a weekly Slack message that goes out to, all the engineers. Okay, how do we leverage that's part of it. That's how do we leverage that to show that it's a control? Like you can use that to satisfy this specific regulation. But it's really understanding the business, what they're doing, what's driving them, what regulations are going to impact them, and kind of ticking and tying and using that to make it, you know, to make it understandable for them, and making that understandable for the executives. I think, big real life examples are always really helpful. And we've seen a lot of that in every industry, you know, so it's not too difficult to find something.
That is true. Um, some companies that are in the stage that we were talking at the beginning, they're assembling the plane as they're flying it. Um, they will have limited headcount or and limited runway. How can someone working in compliance in these situations decide what which regulations or risks they should be investing in that they should prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, there are several ways of doing this, but again, going back to really understanding the business and who the regulators are and what they are prioritizing helps you to do it. Like, for example, you come in new and you're supposed to come up with like a strategic compliance uh, process and program, and what are you going to focus on? And you say, I'm going to have policies and procedures in place. Well, what policies and procedures? What does that mean? What do they, like you have to understand maybe that's not. If it's a payment platform, probably AML is the first thing you need to do, and why it's important, and explaining to them and using examples of why it's important and how, the federal regulators focus on that. If they, are from a small startup and thinking that they might go public or wanting to get more investors for more funding, having an if it's a payment platform, you're going to have an AML program. So, knowing what the business is and what the risk is. So, that, and you're limited, in terms of, uh, like having a staff that can really figure out what's going on. Maybe it's you and two other people. So you're trying to really figure out, and the executives don't have time. So you should go to then maybe, their direct reports and establish a relationship to understand what their concerns and what their risks are seeing, because also you have your compliance hat on and you know what the regulations are, or the regulations at the previous place you worked on, and you're going to focus on that, but you don't understand what the business risk is and what they're focused on. So kind of, all right, I've talked to enough people, or maybe it's just you and you have no one else. So maybe you need to bring in a law firm, or a consulting firm who does uh, compliance risk assessments to help you determine what those risks are. Or maybe it's a really, again, startup flat organization and you have access to the CEO, COO, and the chief marketing officer, and you can get in a room with them, and they can tell you what their risks are and what you should, and then that'll help you determine what you should focus on. But you know, there are different ways of doing it, and you can do a combination of all three things in terms of just understanding, digging in. Like I said, meeting with the executives and getting it from them, meeting with their direct reports if you don't have access to them, um, to understand, or hiring a third party to help you understand what the risks are. And of course, you know, a lot of it if it's a certain product or industry, you can read enough about it to understand what's going to impact and what you should prioritize as, you know, the compliance strategy.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing is on the one hand to have all the pieces of the puzzle together. So these different perspectives internally at the business to assess what those risks are and what will impact the business more. And I also liked what you mentioned, which is go speak with the people that are in the trenches. So also a little bit of a bottoms up approach to really figure things out. So these two pieces seem to be quite important, especially if you're in this stage of growth and not much runway or headcount in your favor.
Yeah. And I know this is like a lot of information to input, but I do have like a methodology, and it's a good segue to the next webinar that we're going to have. There is like a one pager and like a framework that can be like your North Star that you can set up, and whether it's for your entire corporate compliance governance program or that one program that you want to focus, that you can really use to direct and be the North Star for you, for the executives, for your small team or a larger team, to know, okay, here's the mission, here are the roles and responsibilities, this is what we need to build out because this is what the risk is and this is what the regulation we're trying to comply with. And that's really helpful in driving, kind of your agenda, and having a written artifact, to talk to people about, whether it's the executives or your team or the other business. And God forbid that you get audited or regulators come in, you can show them like, no, this is our priority, this is what we're focusing on, and you have something pen to paper to show them.
Hmm. And I think this point you make about the artifacts, having proof is really important. And we hear it also a lot when we speak with compliance people. It's important to have these artifacts on your side to prove that what you've already done and that you're working towards being fully compliant. I know that I'm hammering a little bit on the same point, but considering that we all have leadership to respond to, once you and compliance have all these pieces of the puzzle together, you know what matters, you know what the risks are, how can you communicate this to the leadership and get them on board fast? And I really hope that you're going to mention the example you did yesterday. If not, I will prompt it.
Yeah, no, of course. And sometimes, like, again, speaking their language is so important. Identifying the risks that they care the most, that is what's going to help them listen. But maybe they don't even understand. You know, if you work at financial services, that is decade long of regulatory framework and compliance framework, and you are adjusting to new regulations for niche products, but that's kind of like established. It's easier. They know you're coming in with compliance. If you're working at a startup that it's a new industry, new business, all of a sudden it's new regulators, and the executives have never, or the senior leadership is like, compliance, what's compliance? You got to figure out a smart way of how to talk their language. So at the last company I worked at, it was all about sports. And so how do I translate to them, what compliance is, what is the first line, the business, the second line, in terms of legal and compliance, the third line, audit, because we were getting audited, and why do the auditors matter? Or I've never been audited before. So what my team and I did is, just like to make it kind of more fun and hit home, is we took an image of a football field. We really catered it to the executive leadership of the football teams they rooted for, and showed them that the players were first line. It was the business. This is who's doing the work. This is who's making the money, making the plays. Second line is legal and compliance. This is who you go, your coaches, and you go to them for advice, like, how do I make sure I get the play right? Or you doing And then third line was like the refs. And that's audit or the regulators that they're going to come in and say, hey, that play, that's not right. And so it kind of just lightened up the mood and got some trust in them in terms or in us that like, no, we understand sports, we understand, and this is how we see it in compliance to help you understand. And I think it was just kind of a light way or segue because there was a lot of questioning on why do we have risk and compliance? What's this for? Why do we need it? We may go, but why? We don't understand. And just like us, and so you could like, there's so many different creative ways for the industry that you might be, where our listeners might be working in, where you can make an image or show and just bring it to their top, like to to them, so they understand. And then I think it makes it easier for them to understand why we're trying to mitigate for the risk and what the consequences might be.
Hmm. I love this example. It really brings things to the level of the people that you're communicating with, and gets their buy-in, which is what it is necessary at the end of the day as well. Um, Liz, I noticed that in the work that you do and how you talk about it, you really reframe compliance as more than just risk mitigation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And also, where does that leave one of our listeners today? How can they approach it?
Yeah. So the really what you need to do for the business case of compliance is show the executives how it is a business and competitive advantage against the others in your field, in your playing field. So for example, financial services, and they're long established with the consent orders. What we would do at the financial firm that I worked at is we would look at the consent orders issued to other financial services and then go internally in compliance and almost do an internal audit and to go over, do we have that same risk? Yes, we have that same risk. What are we doing to mitigate? Do we have the same processes? Do we have different processes? Or like a good example is conflicts of interest that you can take across. Like, did we, if someone got a consent order related to conflicts of interest, what is our conflicts of interest, our personal, employee conflicts of interest process? Is it just a policy that says you need to report a conflict? Is there a tool that employees can use? So that's how, no one else is doing it, and we prevented a lot of fines that way to show that we had processes and technology in place. And then I had just thought of the example on the other side for an up and coming tech company that might be a startup and getting ahead of it. Like, you don't have that established regulatory framework or consent orders. You may have new regulators. So having relationships with those regulators or seeing what other companies in your industry, in this new evolving industry, are getting fined for, or what government agencies are looking at them to show the company the risk, in terms of like, this is what is happening. But if we have a process in place, a compliance framework in place with the right policies, procedures, and training for the employees, we can show the regulators, no, we know this is a risk, and this is how we teach our employees to mitigate for that risk. So it's showing them how, you know, you have a competitive advantage over other competitors in your industry or field, or you may already have processes in place, and you have to work really fast in either in any industry. And as we know right now, people work so fast. Oh, so you have something that you hear about a competitor that they got fined for, you need to look right away, do we have that process in place? What is our process? Is it different? And go to the executives and show senior leadership, did this come across? Oh, X company just got fined for this. We don't need to worry about that because this is what, compliance process we have in place to mitigate that risk. Or we could be fined, and this is then how you get resources for your team. Are not able to have a process or controls in place to mitigate for this risk, they're gonna come looking to us next to give, unless we get
Hmm.
something up and going right away.
Hmm. Hmm. Those are all very valid and important points. And Liz, as we're wrapping up, and before I go into my outro, um, I hope you don't mind this last question that wasn't planned, but if someone is just stepping into compliance as their job, as their role, what would you have told yourself when you started in this journey that you would tell to someone that is starting this year or at this moment in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something that I loved about the last place that I worked at is that we really had an onboarding plan for new hires. And what was helpful, like the number one thing to answer your question, is to read the DOJ guidelines on corporate compliance programs, regardless of whether you're a startup and not thinking of going public, or a hyper growth and you might be going public or established, because those guidelines are really the roadmap on how to develop and plan for your compliance programs, so it meets kind of the highest levels here in the US that translate across the globe. And I didn't realize that when I was at, the financial services, but that they were indoctrinating me into that. But that's the first thing I would say is read that and any updates and amendments to understand. And of course, it might seem like a lot, but a lot of the consulting firms like E&Y, KPMG, they write summaries or updates as well to understand. So it's like understand, like, number one, understand how you want to build that compliance program. That's what I would tell anyone starting off. So you understand what you want to do and what your North Star is. And then, like, number two, just as important, is understand that business and company you're going to work for. You really need to understand what's their language, and and how are you agile to adapt and understand that. So I think those are like the top two, I would say, is I'd tell my,
Hmm.
really, even if it's like a business that you're not interested in, but you're interested in the role, to really connect with the business, you have to understand their product and what they're trying to do.
Hmm. I completely agree, Liz. One part is the North Star. The other part is understanding the business and the metrics and the KPIs in order to be able to be impactful in your work. So yeah, thank you for taking that last non-planned question, Liz. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights with us today. You already mentioned that there will be a part two that will be a little bit more hands-on. But if there is a message that I would like to leave our listeners with today, is that, as you heard from Liz, building an effective compliance program starts with understanding your business, understanding your risks, and being able to connect the dots between compliance and the priorities that matter to the leadership. So today we focused a lot on the business case. In part two, as Liz already mentioned, we will shift more to from the why to the how. Where do you start? What do you prioritize? How to make the most of limited resources? And also how to build a program that will grow with your organization instead of slowing it down. If you'd like to join that conversation with Liz and I, feel free to check the link or our FaceUp website to sign up. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, especially you, Liz. It was a pleasure, and we hope to see you in the next session.
Yes, really enjoyed this and looking forward to the next session, which will be live. So you can ask questions on how to do it, and I can, help you through live examples. So looking
That
forward
will
to this. This has been great.
that will be a good one. See you, everyone. Bye.